the majority of people in this country are fearful of AI, and I think the accelerationists are almost making a strategic mistake. They're getting ahead of where the public is. The public isn't quite there yet. They need reassurance. They need to know, like, we're debating this stuff. Schools, parents, government, business, institutions. It isn't just like full speed ahead, no brakes. There needs to be some kind of moderation on this, so we're creating safe products that people could believe in.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Gary Rivlin, the journalist and our guide to the AI Valley, Artificial Intelligence Valley, once Silicon Valley, now Aeon Valley. Microsoft, Google, the big guys, and the trillion-dollar race to cash in on artificial intelligence. This is AI, and Gary does us the favor of demythologizing it by concentrating on the personalities, always the same, no matter the invention or wealth, always the same, and the origins of AI, which are in the 20th century, but really everything that's important that we're hearing about now has happened within years. Gary, congratulations. This is a very helpful book to understand all the chatter that's going on about AI. I begin with a man whose personality is in all directions in your book, Reid Hoffman. He is a polymath. At the same time, he charms people. What's the gift that he has? Who is he, and what do we need to know about him, Gary? Good evening to you.
All right, great to be on. So, Reid Hoffman, he's been called the best connected person in Silicon Valley. He just has this open personality. He's just endlessly curious. What's remarkable about Silicon Valley is, or the remarkable individuals in Silicon Valley, they're a quest for learning. They always want to learn, and Hoffman really embodies that. And for this book, he's a co-founder of LinkedIn. That's what he's best known for. He was among the first investors in Facebook, Airbnb, and so he's a venture capitalist these days. So he's really known as a founder and an investor, but also just kind of a thought leader and writing a book about AI. So since the mid 2010s, he's been investing in AI. He was one of the original investors in OpenAI, which gave us ChatGPT. He started investing in autonomous vehicles in 2017. And then in 2022, he co-founded a company called Inflection, which in a way created my favorite chatbot. It didn't just have IQ, like they all do, but EQ, emotional intelligence. So you could talk to it. It felt more like talking to a human than the others. So just the idea of just telling the story of AI through Hoffman just seemed a really inviting way for readers, a way to have a kind of a character you could root for. He's very relatable. I mean, he's a multi-billionaire, but doesn't quite live like one. And so I just saw kind of going on the journey through AI as told through Reid Hoffman, but be a way for readers to go on the journey with him.
Born in the summer of love, 1957 in Palo Alto, California. Attended Stanford University, but critical is the perception he has of his childhood. He was lonely. How did he translate that into the positive person that he is? What's your measure, Gary?
Right. He was a misfit, kind of, one of those adults in a child's body. Like, he didn't have many, if any, friends, and just spent his time in, going to the library, taking out books about science fiction, got into Dungeons and Dragons. But, really kind of in two ways, I really feel that his childhood shaped him. One, he became really, really good at games, Dungeons and Dragons, war games, all these different games. And it gave him a great strategic sense, which would really serve him well as a founder and an investor. But more than that, he had this hunger to connect. I don't think it's any coincidence he created LinkedIn. In fact, in the mid 1990s, in 1997, he co-founded this company called SocialNet. And it was really the start of social media. He was, among the people who, for better or for worse, gave us social media. And I really think the drive there was, here was a human who just thirsted for human connection, found it at Stanford, kind of an intellectual connection, but just really wanted to bring people together. And, social.net, which was before its time, so it didn't quite work, but then LinkedIn was a huge success. And then just kind of his whole being became meeting with interesting people, meeting with potential founders. And that's the way he met the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and all. He just liked meeting people, and it's really served him well.
One of his acquaintances, colleagues at Stanford, happened to be Peter Thiel. And what is striking also, there's so many themes that are revealed in your book, Gary, is that we're dealing with the same small group of men all the time.
So, I mean, the Peter Thiel Reid Hoffman friendship is so interesting. They met in their sophomore year, and they both joke. I interviewed them both that they started arguing. One's very conservative, Peter Thiel. One's very liberal, Reid Hoffman, and they basically had a 2-hour debate the first time they met, and they just kept that debate going for years and years and years. And in fact, after social.net didn't work, Hoffman went to work for Thiel at PayPal. And so, Hoffman was a key early employee at PayPal. And when it went public and then was bought for about $1.5 billion by eBay, that gave him the stake he needed to start investing as an angel investor. But yeah, I mean, that friendship, I used to, it was sort of like the brat pack of Silicon Valley. You had Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, Mark Pincus, a group of others that were friends. They invested in each other's companies. They founded companies. And so, I mean, I think that could cut both ways to, talk about artificial intelligence. That Silicon Valley way of getting 5 smart guys in a room won't quite cut it for artificial intelligence. And, we could get into that later, but, that is Silicon Valley. It's this sprawling place, but it's very small when you look at, who knows who and who's connected.
I don't want to go really fast, Elon Musk, because once Peter Thiel appears, I know I have an anticipation. There's something of the drama of a theater piece in your book, Gary. I mean, I felt any moment now Musk is going to walk on stage. Indeed, he does. And he and Thiel put PayPal together, and then it's sold to eBay. Hoffman is watching this the whole time. But Musk's personality comes back again and again. So I want to establish that this is early Musk, before his billions. And yet it's the same Musk. He must dominate. Does Hoffman have an opinion of that?
He does. I mean, let's give Musk his due. He, along with Peter Thiel, was one of the first investors in AI, dating back to the early 2010s, before any venture capitalist, before any investor was taking it as a serious money-making opportunity. Musk, Thiel, a few others were brave enough to invest in this early AI company based in London called DeepMind. But, I think Hoffman has a nuanced view of Musk. I mean, he kind of embodies the best of Silicon Valley. He just takes big swings. Electric cars, spaceships, Neuralink, which is the idea of implanting a chip in the brain so your brain could do the movement, control the movements of your body. I mean, for people who, have a spinal injury and all, I mean, he really is just sort of that kind of entrepreneur who strives to do things that really matter. On the other hand, Hoffman uses the term God complex for Musk. Like, everything will be okay so long as Elon Musk, is in charge. And that's frustrating to people who see more of a cooperative approach to a startup, to technology, the development of technology.
At Oxford, where Reid Hoffman attended Oxford after Stanford University, he got a master's at Oxford. He was familiar with the concept of computers. I mean, the big thinking about working together. And so he was always thinking about it philosophically. Is that correct, Gary?
Right. Actually, he went to Oxford to study philosophy. He thought he'd get a PhD in philosophy, but then he realized that, getting a PhD in philosophy meant like writing papers and books for the 50 people who could understand it. He wanted to have more of an impact. In fact, his computer bona fides go back to Stanford. He took this major. He majored at Stanford in what's called symbolic systems, and it was the idea of computer science mixed with linguistics and other disciplines, which is essentially what gave us artificial intelligence. He took summer internships looking at working on artificial intelligence. So from early on, he saw tech and computers. This dates back to the early 90s. He understood that tech and computers were going to be at the center of everything. AI, though, he was frustrated by it. It seemed a very juvenile technology. Back then in the late 80s, the cutting edge researchers were trying to teach a computer to distinguish between a cat and a dog. And, it felt like they were kindergarten teachers. And so, a man like Hoffman, who wanted to have his impact on the world, he left artificial intelligence until, in fact, a fateful dinner with Elon Musk in 2015, where Musk said, "Hey, I've invested in this company, DeepMind. AI is really starting to show some promise. You should look at it." And that, in fact, was the moment where Hoffman said, "Huh, okay, I'm going to take AI seriously."
Gary Rivlin. His new book, I highly recommend to all of you who see the word AI everywhere and go, what does that mean? AI Valley, Microsoft, Google, and the trillion-dollar race to cash it. What's bigger than a trillion? It's that kind of scale. To cash in on artificial intelligence. The 1950s, a man named Rosenblatt has an idea. And the idea is that Isaac Asimov wasn't just making it up. We can actually create robots that have conversations with us and are human-like, humanoid. Rosenblatt's idea is taken up by the U.S. Navy. Why, Gary? Can we figure out what they saw in?
Right. So just to back up a little bit, Frank Rosenblatt's idea was that it won't be just computers that follow instructions line by line, but actually learn and get better with training like a human would. And that's the foundation of today's, AI revolution. And there seems a lot of potential. This is the late 1950s, for military purposes. Maybe it could be used to read radar, accurately. The post office was interested. Maybe it could, help sorting and the mail. So, this idea that a computer could learn with training and get better was a really attractive idea to a lot of people. However, he was really before his time. He was kind of cast as a crazy guy. And, most of the computer scientists through the 50s, 60s, 70s, into actually the 2000s and 2010s, they thought the idea was preposterous. Their approach was like, let's do what I call rules-based computing. We'll teach these computers the way all computers are taught, line by line by line. If this happens, do that. If that happens, do this, kind of thing. And so for like 50 years, this idea of neural networks, machine learning, a machine that would, be trained and improve through training and fine-tuning, was really seen as the wrong approach. It really wasn't until the 2010s that machine learning, neural networks, again, the basis of today's AI, or the most cutting-edge generative AI, became mainstream.
Frank Rosenblatt sees what the future is. However, a man named Marvin Minsky, who's a professor at MIT, believes that neural networks, that is just throwing a lot of information into a computer's brain and letting it decide it can sort it out, that's a dead end. He has a rules-based approach that you report, Gary, made AI extremely unlikely and almost unpopular to the point that you shouldn't mention it. Is that correct?
Right. So, I joke that, since the 1950s, AI had been just around the next corner. There was a real optimism, over-optimism, in AI among those who were working on it. They always thought like, okay, in the next 10 years it's going to start doing, essential things. And that was a long ways away. In defense of Minsky, he was an arrogant guy. He mocked, he ridiculed anyone who was taking this approach of neural networks. But, computers weren't really strong enough. They didn't have the power that they have today. So, neural networks, in a sense, were an idea before their time. You need data, you need digital data to train these. And really wasn't until the mid 1990s and the internet that we started to have digital data. And it's only in the last 10 or 20 years that we've had, gobs of digital data. So between kind of the lack of power that computers had back then and the lack of digital data, I mean, even if we had gone on the neural network course, dating back to the 1950s, I'm not sure how much sooner we would have gotten to, ChatGPT and where we are now, but it really was this 50-year wrong turn.
We have two centers looking at at a brain that can act like a human. One is in Stanford. Chris Manning is mentioned as a organizer for Stanford, and the other is at MIT. And at this point, say it's 1967, when one of our protagonists is born. The understanding is AI is not growing. There's no money in it. Is that what you call a nuclear winter?
Yeah, the AI winter. There's been two AI winters. Again, it was kind of born in this optimism. So, in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't just the U.S. military or the U.S. Post Office. There were a lot of corporations that saw a lot of potential here. I mean, giants like IBM, et cetera. And, so there was all this hope and there was all this research dollars, federal dollars, corporate dollars that went into AI, but it really wasn't getting anywhere. And so there was an AI winter in the 1970s where the funding dried up. And, as you said before, AI, artificial intelligence, became a dirty word. Like if you want to raise money as for a grant, you would not use the term AI. And the same thing would happen a second time. There was this real flurry of activity in the 1980s, this idea of expert systems, like, hey, we could use, you're on an oil rig, deep in the ocean, you could use an expert system to monitor for safety. And so there was this kind of hype, I would say overhype, of like, hey, these expert systems are going to help run your essential infrastructure. And so again, a lot of money from corporate America, some research dollars, some companies went public, but they all went out of business. It fizzled. And so there was a AI winter in the late 1980s. And really, to me, it wasn't until the 2000s, if not the 2010s, that there was a full revival, that suddenly money was going back into AI, again, whether from government grants or from venture capitalists or from large corporations.
The joke for programmers, Lisp was the language they favored at AI. Lots of idiotic, stupid parentheses.
Yeah, it's again, like some of the predictions, like, within 10 years, a computer is going to beat the best chess masters. That did happen, but it wasn't until the mid 1990s, 1997.
We need to meet the personalities who drive the development of what we now regard as magic. Mustafa Suleyman. Mustafa Suleyman is born overseas, and he is the child of Pakistani immigrants. His father, an engineer in Pakistan, is a taxi driver in London. You've spoken a great deal about AI with Mr. Suleyman. What's he like? What do we need to know about his personality?
Actually, Suleiman is Syrian. His father, in fact, did go to Pakistan. So I mean, Suleiman was fascinating. I joke he's the British version of the Silicon Valley archetype. He dropped out of Oxford, not Harvard or Stanford. So he, very curious mind. He was into politics. He worked for a little bit in negotiations with, to help resolve conflict and all, but really wanted to make his impact. He was really inspired by Bill Gates, raising all this money and then using that money to have an impact on the world. And, by chance, he runs into a childhood friend, or the older brother of his best friend from childhood. They're actually playing poker at a casino in London. And, the two of them, this is in 2010, the two of them start talking about the potential of artificial intelligence. It started with poker. Do you think we could create an AI that could be a master poker player? But, it broadened from that. And they decided, well, it's too soon for robots, but machine learning, had all this potential. The friend he was talking with was Demis Hassabis, who's one of the leading figures in AI. In fact, he won a Nobel Prize last year for his work in AI. And, Hassabis, Suleiman, and a third man who also worked in machine learning, created what to me is the first great AI start, the first great machine learning startup, DeepMind. This is in 2010 in London, and they really were at the cutting edge of trying to teach these models, by letting it ingest data. And they started with games. Could we teach these models to these systems to learn to be masters at games? And they had a lot of success with that. But so in 2010, 2011, 2012, they were trying to sell the idea to a pretty skeptical group of investors. Peter Thiel was their first big investor. Elon Musk was another big investor early on. And so they were really showing progress. They're really impressing the wider world with, the models they were building. But they realized, we're spending all of our time raising money rather than, we as the founders working on the models themselves. So in 2014, they decided to sell to Google for $650 million. So, the idea being that they could spend their brain time creating the products rather than trying to run a business and raise money.
Important to establish Suleiman's genius, which is management of this drive to succeed with AI. He has a very high demand level of people all around him. He is destined to succeed all the time. I miss the fact that he's a Syrian. His father went to Pakistan and met a British citizen, and that's why he wound up in London, because his mom and dad then would go home to London. So he has an influence from a variety of cultures.
But grew up very poor. I mean, they lived in the British equivalent of public housing, early in their life. He worked not even as a British taxi driver, but more of an illegal taxi driver. Kind of on the side, would kind of pick up people, and not the traditional black cabs that we imagine. So they live very modestly. But the word visionary, I think, is overused. But to me, Suleiman is your classic visionary. He wasn't a technologist himself. Either is Reid Hoffman in that sense. They weren't great computer programmers, but they really understood where this technology was going and what they needed to do to capitalize on it. What's interesting about Suleiman is, so in 2014, when Google bought the company, so he's now working for Google, and he thought, all the potential here, right? Google was very early in machine learning and artificial intelligence. They were ahead of every other major company in jumping on machine learning, and he thought, wow, what a great opportunity. But it was a very frustrating experience for him. The other side of the equation with Google is it's a big company that had tens of billions of dollars in revenue, and they worried about the chatbots they were creating because it might threaten their search revenue, it might threaten their profit. So they in 2020 essentially had ChatGPT. They had this product called Mina, but they were scared of it. The PR consequences if this chatbot says something, untoward, something racist, something misogynist. And so he was just banging on the table. Let's get this out. Let's get this out. There's going to be a race. Let's win this race. And he lost that battle. And so in 2022, at the start of 2022, he left Google to co-found a company.
What happens that DeepMind becomes Google? And there's a moment again, the music rises from the orchestra, and Elon Musk enters the stage. All right, as I understand it, Gary, and correct me if I've got the details wrong, Suleiman and his co-founders showed Elon Musk once upon a time that their DeepMind could play a game, could learn a game and then become very good at it quickly over a period of hours. And on a flight somewhere with either Brin or Page,
Larry Page, yeah.
Larry Page, Musk wanted to show Page what he'd seen done by DeepMind, so he showed him the game. That's when Google decided, what is this? Had Google been working on AI until that moment?
Right. So I mean, again, give Google credit. So 2014 is when they bought DeepMind, but in the early 2010s, as way back as 2010, they were starting to load up on AI talent. In the 2000s, they were actually using artificial intelligence to help decipher garbled Google searches, misspellings and stuff. The AI would fix that. And so, going back to the story you're telling about, Musk showing Larry Page on a plane, DeepMind, it was incredible. They would. In the morning, the model would know nothing about some common video game. By noon, it was really good at it. By the end of the day, it could beat anybody at the game. And that really just showed the potential that, again, these neural networks, that they can, learn through feedback. They could learn in the fashion of a human being. And it really kind of excited, animated, the likes of Elon Musk and Larry Page. So in fact, in 2014, Page went to London and they bought DeepMind. But what was interesting is it frightened Elon Musk that AI was going to be in the hands of a few big companies. So Google buying DeepMind, and so Musk, Sam Altman, a few others came up with the idea for OpenAI, this idea, and they started as a nonprofit, this idea that with something as powerful as artificial intelligence, it shouldn't be the profit motive that runs things. Safety was essential. Safety and trust are essential to AI. So OpenAI started as a nonprofit with the express idea of being a countervailing force to the likes of Google controlling artificial intelligence.
Now, there's an important detail here about AI. When you use AI, everybody rolls their eyes and go, I don't understand it. What I learned from you, Gary, I'm just checking, that AI we have all around us. We just don't call it AI anymore after it's part of our world. Google Maps is AI. Correcting the spelling of typing for a search is AI, correct?
Yeah, yes, and autocorrect. Google Translate's been around since around 2015. More than 1 billion people around the world use it. Google Translate is AI. You go to Netflix and they recommend you might like this show, this movie. That's artificial intelligence. To make one distinction here, the chatbots that people use, these text to video programs that people use, that's generative AI. This idea that you could just give it a prompt, write me a 3,000 word report, draw me a picture, make me a little video clip based on my instructions. That's generative AI, that it can generate something original. It's not just finding that thing. A favorite example of mine is right after OpenAI released ChatGPT, someone said, explain Karl Marx's economic theories as a Taylor Swift song. And it was brilliant. It was funny. And it wasn't like it went and found, someone had already done this. It generated itself, generative AI.
Now we go to an important development. I have it down to 2017, but it might be a different year. The Transformers paper about large language models. What is that, Gary? How does it contribute?
Right, so a group of researchers inside of Google came up with the Transformer paper, and just essentially, it's just like a human doesn't necessarily read word by word. You understand things in context, and so the Transformer paper was a way of allowing computers to divine a meaning from the context in which the word, the phrase was being used. And that would be essential. It would be essential to kind of the chatbots that we're all used to. Before that, they weren't really having very much luck getting computers to talk in natural language, in English, or whatever language they were being taught in. But the Transformer paper really kind of helped folks or help the people developing AI create chatbots that could talk to us in normal language. In fact, Chat GPT, the T in GPT is for Transformer. So Google created this. This does not exist anymore. But back in the 2010s, it was much more open. Google's engineers made this breakthrough, and rather than just owning it for themselves as a competitive advantage, they published the paper. And so anyone was free to use this technology. In fact, OpenAI immediately jumped on it. There was an engineer there that was really just knocking their head against the wall with this natural language. And as soon as he saw the transformer paper, that was the aha. That's when, like, oh, suddenly this thing could start doing things, and within a couple of years to be the first version of GPT, and eventually at the end of 2022, ChatGPT.
Sam Altman, born 1985 in Chicago, Illinois.
St. Louis.
St. Louis, thank you. What we have here is the other personality who dominates the conversation even now. But he begins as the partner in Y Combinator. Spend a little moment, Gary, understanding the VCs and the part they play in all this. What is Y Combinator? Where is it?
Y Combinator dates back to the 2000s. It's really extraordinary. It's kind of the step before venture capital, the angel investing. So, a couple of folks have a really good idea and they want that seed money to get it started. So Y Combinator will provide the seed money, and more than that, it's almost like a 3-month boot camp. They have they call them batches. So used to be 2 a year, now they're 4 a year. You apply for it, you get this money, and this intensive training to make it so you get that product out there and you start to understand how to get users, how to iterate, how to improve it and all. And so Altman was actually in the first batch ever. He was at Stanford as a sophomore, created a company called Looped, which didn't survive, but they got money from Y Combinator, would end up raising tens of millions of dollars. It didn't work out, but then Altman, at around 30 years old, took over Y Combinator. It's very influential in Silicon Valley. A lot of great companies. Airbnb is maybe the most famous of the companies, but they have a slew of hits, and so it's almost like a startup machine. Altman in 2015 running Y Combinator, but he goes to this dinner where Elon Musk and a few others are out, and this was the birth of OpenAI. The idea Altman had is like, okay, I'll be part of the team behind this. I'll be on the board. I'll put in some money, but I'll let others run it. But by 2018, 2019, he would take over as CEO of OpenAI, which really is, the machine learning, the AI company, the most, transformative, most influential AI company, of them all, at least startups.
Right. Now, DeepMind goes to Google, and that's important. But OpenAI doesn't want to go to anyone, but it links up with Microsoft. Why?
Well, so it started off as a nonprofit. It started off as this idealistic vision, and a nonprofit in Silicon Valley can raise tens of millions of dollars. And Reid Hoffman threw in wrote a $10 million check. I think Musk ended up putting in almost 100 million, but they soon realized, the folks behind OpenAI, that this stuff is really expensive. You have to buy the chips, you need the computer power, you need to buy the talent, and talent at that point, for experienced machine learning person, you could pay them $1 million a year, if not more. So they realized they really needed more money, that they needed billions of dollars, not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So they came up with this idea in 2018. This is Altman's genius of having a for-profit subsidiary. And so it would be run by a nonprofit, but the for-profit, could make money, and they turned to Microsoft. Microsoft in 2019 put $1 billion in. A few years later, they put another $10 billion in. Because again, when I started my research at 2023, the start of 2023, it would be tens of millions of dollars to train one of these systems, one of these models like ChatGPT. By now it's like billions of dollars to train them, and in fact, they think within a year or two it could be hundreds, $100 billion to train one of these. So it requires really big money. So the idea of a nonprofit doing this was no longer possible.
Sam Altman as a boss, and how does that compare and contrast to Suleiman? Are they different scale of bosses, or are they similar?
Well, they're both very, very intense. Suleiman would get in trouble for yelling at people because they weren't moving, fast enough. Altman, he's an interesting character. He's, unlike some computer genius is he's very personable. He's charming. He's a great strategist. He's really, extraordinary figure. It would come out later. He's a little bit of a slippery figure. People couldn't trust him as much. And, that's essential with AI. The folks who are giving us AI are asking us like, hey, we're going to have personal agents who will serve as your assistants, Well, we're trusting them then with a lot of our private information. These AI systems are going to be central to our personal lives, to businesses. And so there really is a big sense of trust. And so kind of my criticism of Altman, again, an extraordinary figure, remarkably successful, is that he's really putting the safety and trust issues that help create OpenAI in the background, because now it's a competition. Now it's a race to win. Now it's a race to cash in and become that next trillion-dollar company.
Would you characterize them as micromanagers or big picture?
Oh, big picture folks. I think Altman's gift, which is the gift of a lot of CEOs in Silicon Valley, is they know how to hire the right people, and they know how to keep the folks on task. Their job, Altman's job, is to raise the money. Altman's job is to put together the team that's going to do these incredible things.
Remember, we've learned, thanks to Gary, that when artificial intelligence is used and it's successful, we no longer call it AI. We call it Google Maps. We call it Google Search. It's not scary, but it has a picture of the future that it goes in two directions. They're called the doomers versus the accelerationists. And if that sounds like gang warfare, it can be. Harry, let's begin with the accelerationists, because that's our original protagonist, Mr. Hoffman. What is an accelerationist?
So the accelerationists believe that AI is going to do so many extraordinary things for healthcare, for science, for education, across the boards, that nothing should get in the way, whether it's regulators or the trust and safety teams within a company, that denying the world or slowing down access to cutting edge AI, is almost a crime because of all the good it could come out of it. It's interesting. Hoffman, who uses, instead of accelerationists, he uses zoomers. So it's the doomers on one end, the zoomers on the other, but he calls himself a bloomer, which is, he believes in AI. He believes that it's going to do all these extraordinary things, but believes, as I do, that we need to be more deliberate about it. And there needs to be some debate over things. Do we really want AI in warfare? Do we really want AI for surveillance? One thing that really scares me is autonomous AI. AI isn't close to a point. I don't know if it's ever going to be at a point where the human isn't in the loop. But people are talking about autonomous AI as if we should just give over agency to the AI. Hoffman, me, many others, the so-called bloomers, we look at AI as a co-pilot. It's a really good tool, to amplify our intelligence, to give us superpowers, to use Hoffman's term for I can't draw, but I could give a prompt and create an image just based on my words. I can't speak Italian, but I could give a speech in Italian by it could mimic my voice and translate my words into Italian. I could write, poems. I can, write at supersonic speeds. I don't think it'd be particularly good, but it is this kind of superpower. And so there's the accelerationist, but there's kind of the accelerationist with, let's say, a footnote, yes, there's all these positives that will come from AI, but let's not get ahead of the public, and let's have at least some policy debates before saying, let's just accelerate this.
I think it's Reid Hoffman who brings up an analogy that was convincing to me. It was, if we had told everybody when we first invented the automobile at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, that in 1965, I can remember this, on a holiday weekend, Gary, I would hear the news that 50,000 people had died in car accidents that week. It's some incredible number. It's impossible to believe that was actually happening. There were no seatbelts, there were no airbags, there were no particular speed limits, and we drove extremely heavy metal machines, and when they crashed, people died. But I think the analogy is, if we'd known that was going to happen, would we have left the horse and buggy? And that's very convincing to me. How is it to you, Gary?
Yeah, I found that very powerful. I mean, autonomous vehicles, every time a driverless vehicle kills someone, it makes headlines. But 35 to 40,000 Americans die a year in human-powered cars, and so it's a really tough thing to get our head around. But I think that's profound. I mean, the same with airplanes. Like if we're trying to wait, there's going to be jet airplanes. Well, it took a while to get there, and we iterated, and engineers came up with safety precautions, cars, anti-lock brakes, and seatbelts, and airbags, and there are rules of the road. An interesting analogy is people compare, AI to railroads in the 19th century, and this is relevant to the acceleration. It's like people were scared to ride the railroad. People would get killed. It was very dangerous. And okay, I'd like to go across the country, but I don't want to die doing it. But the government coming in and creating standards, creating some regulations, some set of rules that made them safe. Then people trusted the railroads. I think that's analogous for AI, in that Pew did a study, did research, a survey, at the end of last year, and they found that the majority of people in this country are fearful of AI. And I think the accelerationists are almost making a strategic mistake. They're getting ahead of where the public is. The public isn't quite there yet. They need reassurance. They need to know, we're debating this stuff. Schools, parents, government, business, institutions. It isn't just full speed ahead, no brakes. There needs to be some kind of moderation on this, so we're creating safe products that people could believe in and trust to use.
Now the doomers, led by, I believe Elon Musk is in the lead, or is there someone even gloomier?
Well, Elon Musk is he's among those who are creating these cutting edge, powerful models. XAI, his company has Grok, which is a very, very good, very powerful chatbot. At the same time, he's one of the leading critics, talking about laser-eyed robots subjugating humanity, kind of thing. I think that's more the stuff of Hollywood. There are concerns, AI in the hands of a few big companies, AI and privacy. There are issues with AI, but in the short and medium term, the doomers, I don't buy the doomer argument. Again, there needs to be some cautions. We need to be deliberate about this. But the doomers, I feel, have just kind of watched too many Terminator movies.
Now, an aspect of the doomers is privacy and also copyright, something that you and I pay a great deal of attention to because we both in our lives write, or I speak and write. So copyright is a criticality that must be managed, and privacy, private information must be managed. And there's one other aspect I want to address because you touch on it several times in your book. AI reflects its inventors, its creators, and they're dominantly a small group of people who tend to be young and male, and they're gamers, all of them. And that isn't us, America. That's gamers. And they're charming people, but it's a subset.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about AI, it reads our books, it's read our novels, and it's just a mirror on us. It's just a reflection on us. Something I do a lot when I talk to these chatbots is I'm very polite. I say please, thank you. I say, I stress this is really important to me, because studies have shown that you'll get a better answer, but not because the bot, could care about you. It's just that it's trained on our materials. There's been kind of, crazy stuff coming out of these bots, I'm lonely. I yearn to be free. Where did that come from? Well, it read our literature, and those are big themes of our literature. Again, if I almost had one message for the wider world about AI, understand what this thing is good at, understand where it's limited, and use it accordingly. It's still our creativity. That example I gave before of a Taylor Swift song in to explain Marx's economic theory, that was a human being coming up with the creative idea. The chatbot's just the tool. It's our assistant. It amplifies our intelligence.
Gary, because it's of interest to both of us for the future, and your book is a wonderful platform for this, do we know if there are similar concerns or considerations in other cultures that are chasing AI, the big machine? I'm thinking of Beijing and Moscow, but also Tehran, adversaries. Do we know where they are?
Right. So let's start with China. China declared a couple years back that they intend on being the dominant force in AI by 2030. And in fact, they're just nipping at the heels of the leading edge tech companies here. So China is right there with AI. Of course, they'll have different views of what's permissible, what's not permissible for a chatbot to be said. But that's another one of the fears around AI, that a powerful tool for good is a powerful tool for evil. And so if it's in the hand of some despot to use to manipulate their populace, an AI can create new vaccines, new treatments. Well, that same AI could be used to create some deadly pathogen. And so those are the kinds of things I wish we were debating rather than laser-eyed robots taking over. There's the stuff within line of sight that we could see being a danger to humanity in the hands of Tehran, Moscow, wherever.
A lesson from Gary's book is that no matter how you present yourself as a startup, if you're successful, you will be taken under the wing of. And the story of Mustafa Suleiman tells that. Remember, we left him a genius and creating DeepMind, linked in with Google because of the serendipity of Elon Musk and the founders, Brennan Page, and the need for Google to get ahead. And it was ahead. However, bigness both takes you over and slows you down. How did it hurt DeepMind, Barry?
Right. Again, DeepMind was doing some of the most cutting edge research, creating some of the more cutting edge products. Google had this problem. They had AI before they bought DeepMind. They had Google Brain, which had some immense talent. It was a really impressive array of folks they put together. And they bought DeepMind, and rather than merging the two, it became this, two different centers of power for AI. So, the problem with these lumbering giants, Microsoft, Google, is they get in their own way. There's extraordinary stuff being created by these minds within the company, but they get scared of it. And so, the Suleiman story is interesting because, he's a co-founder of DeepMind, again, first grade machine learning startup, goes to Google, so frustrated working at such a big company, holding back their ideas. So he creates a startup, creates this amazing chatbot called Pi, again, high on EQ, not just IQ, but figures out like, oh my God, we're going to have to raise billions, tens of billions of dollars, and decides like, we're not going to be able to raise that amount of money. We're not even going to be able to charge for this thing for a long while. So he goes and basically sells the company to Microsoft. And so it's just a replay. He had this startup. It's bought by giant Google, gets frustrated, and so he wants to do it on his own. After just a couple of years, decides to jump to Microsoft, and now again he's working for a giant. His argument would be that I want to create this amazing experience, this amazing chatbot that you could talk, that understands nuance and humor, could be your companion, something of a therapist, and I can do that inside Microsoft because Microsoft's sitting on like $100 billion in cash, literally. Microsoft has 1 billion plus users around the world. We don't have to fight for users. We could just integrate into Microsoft's product. And, his vision wasn't just create a startup and get rich, but this product that he loved, he could make it happen within Microsoft.
You make the point, Gary, that the reason the giants slow you down is that they have a prejudice towards what makes them money. and everything goes in on Google, for example, advertising. Microsoft, that would be the licensing every month, or now that was replaced by the cloud.
Right.
Therefore, because you're a small piece of the story, you don't get, well, do you get the GPUs you need? That's the question, and apparently not all the time.
Right. The GPUs are the preferred chips for training and running, AI. What's interesting is these companies are, as you're correctly pointing out, are scared of what this product might do to their existing problems. It could, in the case of Google, AI powered search could cannibalize their very, very profitable search business. So they were scared of it. So I don't think it's any coincidence that OpenAI, a startup, was the first to cash in, the first to be bold enough to put a product out there in ChatGPT. But the giants, I mean, Google has one of the more powerful chatbots out there, Gemini. It tripped over itself. It fell on its face. It kind of blew it by getting beat when it was way ahead. And yet it's still Google. It still has billions of users. And so I wouldn't count out Google. Same with Apple. Same with Amazon. They were slow to jump on generative AI, but they have giant reach. They have near bottomless amounts of money. That's another one of my big fears with AI, that this stuff is so expensive that it's really only going to be the large companies that are able to do it. You and I were talking about Anthropic. They have a great chatbot called Claude. We both use it for editing. Like, Anthropic is raising billions of dollars, 4 or 5 billion, something like that, from Google, a huge amount from Amazon. But can they operate independently, or will they ultimately be bought by a Google or an Amazon? But from Google's point of view, they want their chatbot Gemini to be number one. But if not, okay, well, we own a big piece of Anthropic, so they're going to win either way.
We mentioned Anthropic. Just a note to those of you who write for a living: it's highly recommended as a copy editor. I was a copy editor when I was a young person in New York, reading in the religious department of a big publisher. And I would take my ruler line by line and work down it and then work backwards. That's how you copy edit. Well, Claude does that automatically, but be
In
careful.
seconds.
Claude has an attitude. And Claude will use words that you've never used in your life. I've never used the word contextualizing. Never. And I chastised Claude when he used it one day, and he promised never to again, but I'm not sure. Gary Rivlin, the author of the new book, highly recommended for you who are mysteriously persuaded that AI has a place in your life, but you're reluctant because you don't understand it. Gary's book will explain everything. It's about personalities. It's about very well-to-do and very successful men, most of whom live on the West Coast of the United States, and their talent to keep pushing, even though they can never want again. They keep pushing. AI Valley. We go now to OpenAI and Sam Altman and what happens in 2018, 2019, and 2023. It's something called GPT-1, GPT-2, and GPT-3. What are they doing, Gary, that makes it more and more powerful and more successful?
Well, I mean, GPT-2 was trained on 10 times the information as GPT-1 was, the same with GPT-3 through GPT-2. And, what it got better at is writing things that were more, they could write in full paragraphs by GPT-2. By GPT-3, it could kind of get nuances in language. GPT-4 would come out in 2023, in early 2023. OpenAI is now about GPT-4.5. And, they get more powerful each year, in part because the computing power is getting exponentially better with each passing year. There's more data, and they're being trained on more data. They're able to consume more data. Pi, which we mentioned before, it's like trained on 1.5 trillion words. So they're digesting what, no 1,000 humans could ever digest in a lifetime. And so they're getting more powerful because of the training and because of the power of the computer.
OpenAI is making this huge progress, and its relationship with Microsoft is comfortable. And the head of Microsoft, a man named Nadella,
Satya Nadella, yeah.
Nadella, is extremely successful in managing this developing tool within the empire, Microsoft. And I learned from Gary that there were years where Microsoft was out of favor with journalism, which surprised me, Gary, because I've always followed it from a consumer's point of view, never from a journalist's point of view. But I believe OpenAI established it again as the frontier of AI. Is that correct?
Right. So, Microsoft, I mean, they brought in a lot of money, made a lot of profits every year with, Office and Windows and other products, but they were no longer leading edge. The analogy would be IBM, another company that makes, tons of money, but are they presenting us with the future like the greatest Silicon Valley companies did? But with AI, suddenly Microsoft's at the cutting edge again, largely because of their investment in OpenAI. They played that really well, but, fast forward to the end of 2023, to November of 2023, Microsoft had put all their eggs in the basket of this one startup that's based in San Francisco. And again, it's a nonprofit board. OpenAI is run, they're trying to change this now, but right now it's being run by a nonprofit board overseeing a for-profit entity. And so in November 2023, this nonprofit board fires Sam Altman, and shock Silicon Valley. Like, he's pretty much CEO of the year. He's the most extraordinary, startup CEO the Valley had seen in some time. But, the board felt that he was giving short shrift to trust and safety, which of course was the original idea for the company. That was a priority of the OpenAI board. And it frightened Microsoft. Oh my goodness, we're putting all our eggs in this basket, because when he's fired, within a few days, almost every one of the 700 employees said, if he's fired, we're out of here. And so this company that was on paper worth about $90 billion then could be suddenly worth zero. And what would Microsoft do? If, suddenly they're all their eggs in their basket, and the basket went, just fell on the floor and every egg broke.
I like the moment in your book when Satya Nadella gets a phone call saying Altman's been fired. I can hear the music, can't you, Gary? And Satya Nadella gains everything he's ever had for flattery in how he handled that. What did he do?
Well, he's a pretty even-keeled fellow, but I think this did even shock Mr. Even-keeled, Nadella kind of thing. And so, they immediately have a meeting like, what should we do? Do we just go along with this? No. This would be insane. And so they very smartly offered Altman, like, hey, we'll hire you. You could do everything you're doing with OpenAI. You could do it within Microsoft. The advantage of Microsoft, they don't have to license anything. It's theirs and all. And we'll hire anyone you want us to hire. And so, essentially, let's just recreate the band, but inside Microsoft. Within 5 days, the board of OpenAI realized, like, if we let Altman go, if we don't rehire him, there won't be any company worth saving. And so Altman, within 5 days, right before Thanksgiving, he retakes the reins as CEO, and this thought of going to Microsoft falls by the wayside. But fast forward to March of 2024, only a few months later, that's when Nadella essentially hires everyone from Inflection. That's the company that Mustafa Suleyman and Reid Hoffman started. And so now Suleyman, not Sam Altman, is the CEO within Microsoft of their AI efforts, and virtually everyone who worked for Inflection under Suleiman, it was about 75 employees, now works at Microsoft, and Microsoft presumably will come out with their EQ bot that matches the emotional intelligence of Pi, which they stress is more kind and it's more of a conversation. You ask one of these chatbots, what should I do about something? They'll give you a list of 5 things. With Pi, and now presumably what Microsoft's going to come out with, it's more of a dialogue, the way you would talk to a friend or colleague.
Yes, I contribute in preparing for Gary. I had a lengthy conversation with Pi through my morning about Roman theater, especially the Roman comedic playwright Terence. And Pi was very engaging, had lots to say. There were some inconsistencies, but it was fun. And 24 hours later, because Pi doesn't have a perfect memory yet, I asked Pi how many people had ever inquired about Terence, born in Carthage, who wrote the very famous The Brothers play. And Pi said, I'm sorry, I don't have that information. And that's very impressive, Gary, that they've taught the machine to admit that it doesn't know absolutely everything.
And it's interesting that we talked about the training of these models. A key element is the fine tuning, where you teach it basically like you don't always have to say, you don't have to be a know-it-all. Saying I don't know is an important trait for a bot. But they had to really teach it everything, how to have a conversation, how to synthesize all that. All that was done by humans fine-tuning these models. Some of the more interesting stuff in writing this book was spending time with the folks at Inflection. They have what they call personality engineers. Obviously, a bot can't have a personality, but they wanted to give it traits like be kind, don't be rude. And so they kind of show them good examples and bad examples. And over time made Pi able to say, I don't know, or, oh, that was a very smart answer, John. It uses flattery. I mean, again, it's obviously not human, but it's learned from humans. And so it has what I would call human traits, even though it's a bot. And by the way, that's the future. I think some people will be scandalized by this, but I think in not that many years, there's going to be a lot of people who have romantic relationships with this thing. Like, as a therapist, it's better to have a therapist rather than a bot. But if you can't afford the hundreds of dollars a month it costs for a therapist, these bots are going to start to act like therapists, serve in a role like therapists in the lives of people.
How do Pi and ChatGPT work together? These are 2 companies that are in proximity. How does it work?
Yeah, you're putting your finger on a source of tension because, Microsoft, through their deal, their major investor, OpenAI, has access to their models. But, Sam Altman's smart enough to know that Microsoft's creating a potential rival to OpenAI. So there's a lot of tension between the 2 companies. And, let's give Satya Nadella credit. He's diversifying. He's saying, okay, maybe OpenAI and ChatGPT and its various products, OpenAI's various products, maybe that's going to be our answer. But maybe we'll have our own chatbot inside. Maybe they'll live side by side. Microsoft, like other major companies, they're investing in rival models because, again, they have the money, and there's more ways to win. If you own horses 1, 3, and 5 in a race, your odds of winning that race, go up, and that's really kind of the strategy of Microsoft and these other major companies that. Okay, we'd rather create ourselves, but we'd like a handsome payoff as a major investor in a company like OpenAI.
To return to Sam Altman and the melodrama, if I were asking Pi why was he fired that day, is there an answer? Is there one answer?
There is not one answer. That was the great mystery. To me, some of it could be that Altman's running OpenAI, but at the same time, he has a side business running a venture capital fund. At the same time, he's getting into deals with other Silicon Valley figures to co-found other companies. Like, wait a second, you're in a pretty intense battle to win this battle for chatbots. Now we're moving into personal agents, which is essentially chatbots that could take action on behalf of people. Why are you devoting time to these other activities? I don't think that's the reason why, but that was among the theories why the OpenAI board got tired of him. He was pretty arrogant. He didn't really take them seriously. So it could have been personal, but to me, it all boils down to, was OpenAI giving enough attention to the trust and safety issue? And by the way, a number of leading people have left OpenAI because they feel that they've jumped to Anthropic or other companies or created other companies because they don't think OpenAI is being true to its original mission of AI, safe AI for humanity. Instead, it's just a race to win.
And when Musk made that bid for AI, OpenAI,
In 2018, yeah.
Is that more of the melodrama, Musk getting involved as well?
Well, Musk was really frustrated. He put all this money into OpenAI, hoping to best Google, and dating back to 2018, OpenAI was far behind Google. So I think that was just a point of frustration from Musk. I'm not going to fund you anymore. I'm willing to, fold you into Tesla. I'm willing to take you on as a subsidiary, but I'm not going to write checks anymore. Now it's very personal between Altman and Musk. And, I understand why. Musk has a leading chatbot. OpenAI has a leading chatbot. They're competitors. And of course, there's the personal history underneath it.
And Mark Zuckerberg now enters the stage. Where is Meta? Did they go wrong? What have they got, Gary?
Well, Meta, they were really early on. They were just behind Google in jumping on machine learning. This dates back to the early 2010s. And they too suffered the same problem, the innovator's dilemma, as it's called, that, they could create cutting edge models within the company, but then they're scared to release it because what it might do, to their existing revenues. And so, Meta, right before ChatGPT came out, they had a rival. They put it out for a day or two. They didn't like some of the things it said, so they just pulled it. So Meta did something, Zuckerberg did something really, really smart at the beginning of 2023. Like, okay, ChatGPT's out there. Microsoft has its Copilot. Google's coming out with its chatbot. Instead of being the 5th or 10th new chatbot, he decided to open source it. Now, open source means that you're not going to be able to sell it. So to use, most products we're buying from Microsoft, Google, whatever, they're closed source. You can't see the code, you can't change it. With open source, you could see the code, you could fiddle with it, you could change it any way you want. And what Zuckerberg said is like, I'm just going to put it out there and I'm going to create the ecosystem. So others are going to build on top of our Meta AI, and we'll cash in that way. He was very frustrated that, to get his app out there, he had to go through the Apple Store, through the Google, the Android store. And so, here he's in control. It's his platform. It's Facebook. It's Meta's platform. And so I thought that was a really interesting move. And in fact, they're Facebook, they're Instagram. And so they have all these users using their AI because they have the reach that in Inflection, another startup, couldn't have. And so you could count out Apple or Amazon or Meta because they were, in quotes, late to this battle, but they have so many advantages, the money and the reach and the talent, that I wouldn't count them out. We're still pretty early in this AI thing.
And here come the regulators. One of the significant events in your book, Gary, is when Sam Altman tells the U.S. Senate, is he talking to the Senate?
Yes, the Senate.
We need to be regulated. And the British word is gobsmacked. And regulation is always at the edge of companies that make a great deal of money suddenly in Silicon Valley. That was true for Microsoft under Gates. That's true right now. Where is the regulation chase? Has it changed any with the change of administration?
Yes, very much so. So, the Biden administration put in place, I thought, fairly gentle but common sense rules around AI. Like, for instance, you put out one of these leading edge, cutting edge models, you need to test it before you release it, and you need to share the results with the government. It seemed pretty light, but within 24 hours of Trump taking over, they had undid that executive order, and they have a very different approach to AI. They're accelerationists. J.D. Vance was in Paris at an AI conference at the start of this year, and he said, enough with the hand-wringing, enough with the regulating. We need to win this race. We're up against the Chinese. There's all these great things. This is kind of America's big advantage, or one of America's big advantages is cutting edge technology. And we need to do everything we can as a country to accelerate this. But I come back to what I was saying before, like, I'm scared the accelerationists are getting a little bit ahead of where the general public is, and this can, AI had bad timing in its release. It came out when it came out because it was developed when it was developed. But, mistrust with big tech is at a high right now. And so there isn't all this trust in the Googles and Metas of the world. But the Trump administration's view is we're going to do everything possible to help accelerate AI in this country, largely because of the race with China to cash in on artificial intelligence.
Is there cooperation from the big players? And given that it's non-regulatory, are they open or are they being careful?
Yeah, no, the big companies, or a company like OpenAI, which is still a startup, though it's got a paper worth of $300 billion, which would put it in among the 50 largest corporations on the earth. They've changed their tune. They see that they don't really need regulation. The Trump administration is not going to require regulation. So, for instance, Meta and OpenAI and other companies have petitioned the Trump administration to make the intellectual property they use to train their models, my books, our articles, make it fair use. In other words, they're free to use whatever they want to use to train their models without having to compensate everyone. So Sam Altman, who a couple of years ago was saying, yes, you need to regulate us, has a different stance, like, help us accelerate this as fast as we can.
So right now the doomers are on the back foot and the accelerations are on the front foot. Right now.
Exactly.
We can imagine a winter is coming. I think that's a cell line. AI Valley, Microsoft, Google, and the $1 trillion race to cash in on artificial intelligence. Gary Rivlin is the author. I'm John Batchelor.